Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Let me congratulate all of you on your attendance. I know it's virtual, but still, it's great for all of you to be here so faithfully. I'm going to begin with a prayer and then actually um, a prayer and a few notes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric. So let's pray. Teach us, O Lord, the way of your statutes, that we may keep them to the end. Give us understanding, that we may observe your law and keep it with our whole heart. Cause us to walk in the path of your commandments, for we delight in them. Incline our hearts to your testimonies and not to gain. Turn our eyes from looking at vanities and give us life in your ways. Confirm to your servants your word, who are devoted to fearing you. Turn away the reproach which we dread, for your ordinances are good. Behold, we long for your precepts. In your righteousness give us life. Amen. So just four quick notes. Gary had a question about quiz 5, and so we'll look at that after our three presenters tonight. I did send you a note with the email earlier today about formatting. And so if you notice, you see how there's the verse number, and then and you can have more than one in a bunch if it's material that kind of sticks together and you're treating it as a group. So just a small formatting note. It makes it easier for me and for others to follow your work. Also, I wanted you to know I'm working back through those of you that have already presented. I'm working back through um, what you wrote and making notes, and I'm going to scan those documents with my notes on them and email those to you. And so I hope to be catching up with everybody, and so getting you notes sooner than later, certainly well before your second time presenting, so that you have time to think about my comments and maybe make some um, edits or changes in what you have to prepare for the second time. And also the second round through, I was going to have the first presenter say the prayer from Psalm 119 for us. So we'll have time for questions at the end of class or during, so I want to turn it over to Eric. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you are all doing well tonight. I want to start just by thanking the professor for his comments that he added on here that helped me with some revisions and thinking about this in a different way than I had originally. So the first comment the professor made was on how this text is very simple, plain, and clear. And that was something that struck me from the beginning. I would read through it, it seemed very clear to me what it was saying. So for me, that made it kind of challenging to go deeper into the text. It just seemed to me at the onset that most of it was right there on the surface. So this is where the professor's next comments helped me out, bringing in some context and thinking about how it applies to us in our time, helped me go a little bit deeper into it. For the historical context, this passage is from Deuteronomy, and it's set in the time when the Israelites are preparing to enter the Promised Land, and God is renewing His covenant with Israel. In my first pass at this, I approached the text by trying to identify some different themes that were presented, and these were choices, instruction, reward, and punishment, and promises. So for the first theme of choices, in verse 15 it says, "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity." So God doesn't force us to take just one path in life. He gives us free will, and He lets us determine our own path. And He also gives us instruction. In verse 16 it says, "If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances. So God does not leave us without information. We need to make our choices. And he lets us know which actions will lead to which outcomes. The next theme is reward and punishment. So God gives us the full information. He lets us know what outcomes are possible, the good and the bad. He lets us know the totality of our choices and what they lead to. In verses 16 through 18, it says, "Then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish, and not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess." So he lets us know what the outcomes are going to be. And then there's promises. In verse 19, he says, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live." So even though he doesn't have to, God makes his promises in a very, very clear way. So moving on to some of the professor's next comments, here's a question. So he says, consider what it is saying, how it was true then, how it is still true, the trouble it is making for us, and what next. So this question of how it is still true has been something that I wrestled with. This passage is part of the Sinaitic covenant that God made with the Israelites. So a follow-up on the how is it still true for us today, there's the question of, does the Sinaitic covenant apply to Gentile Christians? Now, Martin Luther held the view that it did not, that God's law is written on our hearts, and that the Sinaitic covenant was only for the Israelites. So, given that, the question of how is it still true is a very good one. And honestly, I don't have an answer to that. I know this is supposed to be more of a presentation than a discussion, but just at this point, I'd like to take a quick pause in case anyone wants to make a comment on that. It's a good point for discussion, otherwise I can keep going. Going once. Going twice. Okay, moving on. Oh, Simmons, you got in right at the bell.
I got him right at the bell. Great. Kind of taking your question or your discussion kind of in. Can you hear me all right, by the way? All right, good. I just plugged in my mic. When I read all the verses before class, I hope we're supposed to, but I certainly do. And what I saw kind of here when you're talking about God's law and ordinances and commandments, I saw, the section before is, love God with all your heart is always what comes to mind when I think of Deuteronomy. And it kind of went with the reading I had today from 1 Corinthians 13. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on top of my usual devotions. But 1 Corinthians 13, the verses 1 through 3, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I've gained nothing. So even if it's a discussion about what covenant, we wonder necessarily what the command of this, if you don't have love, and God, as we read in John somewhere or First John somewhere, that we know God is love. If you have not love, and obviously loving the Lord your God is loving love. I mean, I feel like 1 Corinthians answers that a bit. If you don't have love, you're nothing. So in a way, it applies in the context of the whole Bible.
Yeah, no, the love is definitely there, and Jesus backed that up, reiterating when he summed up the commandments in love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, love your neighbors yourself. So yeah, that's constant throughout. But some of what I was kind of thinking of is the like the promises, and if you let's see, if you obey the commandments, I will bless you. So that's kind of the. I mean, we're not saved by works, we're saved by faith. So even if we keep his commandments, what does that mean for us today? Is he going to bless us because we keep them? Um, so I was kind of thinking of it along those lines. Enoch.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So, yeah, I was reading these verses also. What I mean, what kept my mind, or what attracted my mind was the question of choice. Yes, God said, "I am putting two ways in front of you," and but God give us, free will. You can choose whatever, but He gave us the two ways, but we can choose. But also, I'm thinking about the hint that he also put in front of us, because he tells us that, yes, if you follow these commands, this is what's going to happen. But if you don't, this is what's going to happen. And then the prophet also was really serious about saying you should choose life. And then that's where I'm like, where's the choice now? Because it's like okay, I should I choose? Okay, I have the choice to choose to die, or like, because he said, I put in front of you death and life, but the prophet, inspired by God, said choose life. I don't think that's a choice now. Is it a command, or is like just a suggestion to ask us, oh, choose life? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, although we have a choice, choosing death seems kind of dumb. We want to choose life, but we're sinful and we screw up. So sometimes, without even making that deliberate choice, we might choose the wrong path. Uh,
Yeah,
Professor,
I got
you
you.
raise your hand.
Yes, thank you. I mean to be polite and respectful because I'm right at the moment. I'm not the leader. You're the leader. So a couple of things, and I think we'll pursue the discussion as if you keep referencing the notes that I had. There's some true and falses there, and we can have actually good conversation. So Eric, you have good instincts, that even though the text isn't the kind that has lots of hermeneutical soil to dig through as far as words and phrases and that sort of thing, it has a really colossal, big subject matter in it. And so at least two things going on already is the bilateral covenant between God and Israel, of Sinai, having to do with their physical life and well-being in the promised land, is taking place within the unilateral covenant that God made, and repeated. So from Adam and Eve to Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth. And so part of the history here is the opportunity to contrast, if when it comes to mind that, hey, human nature, hey, I think that I can do what I need to do to live. I don't have to have God do everything for me. I could be autonomous even. That's the nature of Adam's corruption. And so it comes to all of us. So God provides opportunity in history, kind of within the safety of his one way, that's unilateral. God's promises to redeem and provide for us. Okay, here's an experiment. Not like God doesn't know how it's going to turn out, but here's an opportunity for us to be a witness against ourselves, and he'll use language eventually. The other thing, and this was bound up in the question I was asking, um, what is he saying? Well, there's three kinds of things that are bound up in this law in the Pentateuch, and so there's the ceremonial law, which of course was fulfilled by Christ, and we see that in many ways in the gospel, and that's explained and so forth. So no more circumcision, no more animal sacrifices, no more Passovers. All of those things are fulfilled, and so there's a permanent sort of a Sabbath from the ceremonial law. There's the civil law, which still works. It's in effect for everyone, and that's just on the basis of cause and effect. So people just have a better life together if they're paying attention to the kinds of things God said. You know, don't take advantage of a blind person. Don't move landmarks. You know, that sort of return things to your neighbor if you know they belong to him and they're lost. And then at the very core of all of that is the moral law, which is always binding. And so the principle remains true. If a person were to obey all of the law, so emanating from the moral law, but then that same person would do everything that the law requires and is appropriate by time and circumstance, then that person would live. So the big picture is, and Eric, your instincts again were right, and the other students that Chris and Enoch too, is, well, we're not always talking about that we're saved by grace or our need to be saved by grace, but first we're going to talk about how we know the necessity of salvation by grace by way of our experience under the law. And yeah, so the law is our tutor to bring us to Christ, and the law always accuses and so forth. But the principle is read even in the New Testament about the commandments. Whoever does them shall live by them. And of course, that exposes the problem. So I hope that's helpful, everybody.
Very helpful. Thank you, Professor. So in the interest of time, I know we wanted to keep these to 15 minutes or so. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just run through the homily and Bible class outline just so that I completely go through that. And then I'll circle back on the true-false questions. And whatever time we have left, we could focus on those. So for the homily outline, I went with kind of the theme of duality that's present in the text, life and death. And it's clearly a binary choice, and a lot of outcomes in our life come about from binary choices, choosing between right and wrong. And I think this duality carries over into the law and gospel paradigm. The law without the gospel leads to death, and only the gospel can lead us to true life everlasting. So that's what I would try to focus on for a homily. And then for the Bible class outline, I just kind of listed some questions that I would focus on as, if a group was going through the text and then asking, what choices has God laid before you in your life recently? How has God instructed you to inform your choices? What are the rewards and punishment you face in your choices? And how do God's promises affect your life? So that's what I would try to do for the Bible study. So for whatever remaining time we have left, I'll circle back on these true-false questions that were kind of fun to think about. The first one was true or false? If we obey God, we will live and God will bless us. So I would definitely say false on the first part, but the second part could be unclear. So we are saved and gain everlasting life through faith in Christ, not by what we do. But as far as God's blessing, it kind of made me think, how does he look on those today who try to love him with all our heart, mind, and soul? Does he grant favor to anyone because of the intent that we have in our hearts? So that I'm not real clear on. Anyone can chime in and raise their hand if they want to say anything about that one. The next one is true or false. Our hearts can turn away. That seems pretty true to me. We are sinful by nature, and our hearts turning away from God is virtually an unescapable reality. So that kind of makes it obvious on the next one. True or false? Our hearts are bound to turn away. Yes, our sinful nature is going to lead us right down that path. Now this here, and Professor, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Contradicting design necessarily means death in every way at every level. I wasn't sure what you were asking there, so I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that one at all. Okay. Well, that pretty much does it. That was everything that I really wanted to cover. So I'll open it up to any questions.
So it's good. It's good to wait for questions, though, Eric. I think since you already had opened it up for discussion, I'm going to kind of just maybe supplement a little bit what you were doing, and the guys can, or the students, sorry, can ask a question of either of us as we go here. If they're asking you, I'll turn my microphone off.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, yeah, thank you, Eric. And we could spend maybe the rest of the semester on the questions this raises, but let me just try and do this. Here in verse 16, this question, true or false, if we obey, in a way, I mean, we're doing two things with by looking at this statement. The if part of the statement, given the condition of the corruption of human nature, what's the likelihood that we're going to obey? Well, it's zero. Even if we succeeded in an outward performance of the law, it would still be undermined by the corruption in our nature. In other words, at the very least, we'd still be doing good things for selfish reasons, and that's wrong. We will live and God bless us. Now what we can think about when we get here is, well, what if there was a person that did obey God absolutely 100% in every way all of the time? Well, we actually have a look at that person, and that person is Jesus from conception to ascension, doing all things absolutely exactly right all the time and in the stead of each one of us. And so this is a moment where we get to say, well, I certainly and no one can obey God. That's why we have a substitute, this thing called substitutionary or vicarious atonement, where Jesus is trading places with us. And so even Barabbas is a historical living witness and example of how this works, is that Jesus accepting the burden of the law, even, or maybe we should say especially for Barabbas, and what happens? Barabbas goes free. He's released. And so there's a beautiful historical, physical example of in a small window into a bigger picture. I posed a question on purpose right here because I hear this a lot. I hear people say things, but we can still rebel against God, and all the language of possibility rather than certainty. If you look through the Bible from Genesis through Revelation, what kinds of language does it use about human nature descending from Adam? Every intent of the thought of the heart was only evil all the time. That's Genesis 6. Mark 7, Jesus talks about the heart of man is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Out of it flows, and there's this whole long shopping list of everything horrible. and then Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 3. So when you were dead in trespasses and sins, so what's the likelihood of a dead person making a positive choice or any choice at all, really? And see in Ephesians 2, it's worse than being like nothing's happening dead. It's an active deadliness. It's a contradicting design. Eric noticed that in language in the third true false here. Um, Dead in trespasses and sins in which you once walked, but it's worse than that, according to the course of this world, but it's worse than that, according to the prince of the power of the air, who is now at work in the sons of disobedience. So what's important here is when we hear this language of potential, of possibility, that we pause and say, well, actually, it's not that it might happen, it's that it's the only thing happens until God's regenerative work takes place. And this is why I put in the second possibility, which Eric recognized right away is true. Our hearts are bound to, and I chose the word bound on purpose. And then so to get to the third one that Eric was asking about, so contradicting design. You can go back and read Genesis 1 and 2 and kind of see the picture of God's design and intent in creation. Nothing dies, everything functions according to the way of life and lives and thrives, and all of that. And then you'll notice that Jesus often reflects back on, or he'll reference Genesis 1 and 2 when he's answering questions about how things are supposed to be. And then in every way and at every level, thinking about every possible relationship, both between God and neighbor, enemy, thinking about body, soul, and spirit. So God's design is absolutely comprehensive, and in any place where we would contradict that design, now we're going to cause trouble in the whole system. And so you know how human physiology is a sympathetic system. So when one part suffers, all the parts suffer, because all of the parts are trying to enlist whatever kind of energy or properties they have to promote or provide for healing. That's a mini version of God's whole universe. And so Enoch was kind of working on this one too, is God setting a choice before us. Did you notice anywhere in the text ever where God says, okay, now it's up to you? So the language of choice is used, but of course it wouldn't matter if God actually used the language of, okay, here's two things on the table, now you decide which one you're going to pick, because we would always pick the wrong thing. So even in Israel's history, if you reflect back on texts where God said, okay, here's how the bilateral covenant works, and Israel was always very quick to say, yeah, and we're going to do all of that. All that the Lord has said we will do. And of course, never, ever, ever, ever even began to do that. And there are other texts that really importantly reflect on that property of Israel, texts that say things like they never actually left Israel, but Egypt, sorry. They were always carried Egypt with them in their hearts, meaning the corruption that they were so devoted to and bound up in Egypt, they carried with them, and we see it again and again and again through these narratives of the Exodus. Okay, so how to know is a really important question. The language of an offer being made is not used, but Enoch noticed is the 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 reality. There we go. The reality of always two possibilities setting before us, right or wrong, good or evil, is one thing. The freedom to choose one or the other is another thing, which we clearly lack, as Adam also lacked. Freedom, because freedom needs to include not only the ability to control my will or to direct my will in a good situation, but the knowledge, awareness, and determination to always do that, which is what we see in Jesus. So we maybe can come back to this last point later, talking about our free will. And if we don't have time to come back to it, we may cross paths with this again in a text during the semester. I've been working on this subject of free will for, well, all these years, and just most recently in the last few semesters began to put together a sequence of PowerPoint slides that would allow us to actually think it through, to stop, kind of bouncing this topic around and come to a conclusion that we could be certain about regarding this contention for a free will. So our time's almost up for this first of the three presentations. So I just wanted you to know I do have material for us to look at about this if time allows, or interest, or both. But before we run out of time, I want to open it up again. So anybody have questions either for me or Eric, and we'll turn our microphones on accordingly. Yeah, Gary.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Good. Professor, is it possible that in this context, you think of the term commandment in the sense of the Mosaic law, kind of, which includes the promises? There's before this passage, there's the word near you, right? And it's easy for you to do it. I mean, in that sense, that hear the voice of the Lord. So that is Jesus, and we know that in New Testament, and hear Him. So can we, I mean, take that text toward that direction?
That,
That's my
yeah,
question.
Gary, that's a really good suggestion. And so, yeah, let's work. What if we work out in concentric circles a little bit from the smallest circle, the conditional statement, if you obey the law, then I will bless you. That has to be true because God's saying it, okay? And then start to work our way out, but we find Israel's failure to do that. But then as we're working our way out, which includes backwards, as Gary mentioned, preceding this, so surrounding, if you will, or sort of the prequel to this text is the Deuteronomy 6, of course, so important. Um, uh, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then these words which I speak to you today, yeah, they'll be in your heart and in your mind and on your door, the whole. So you're going to be immersed. You're going to live a life immersed in the Word, and that Word, and often in the biblical texts, especially Old Testament texts, the Torah doesn't just mean law specifically, but it means all the words that came to us by way of Moses. So it's law and gospel, requirements and promises, and that is the way God deals with our two natures. So the law, the law addresses the arrogance and corruption and dishonesty of human nature that's forever saying it will, but never actually doing. And this is the kind of thing that the letter of James addresses so vigorously. And then the gospel, which is providing two things, well, lots of things, but on the one hand, it's providing a remedy for the failure and even for the arrogance of human nature, and at the same time regenerating the soul. So I wanted to, last comment for Eric on the class on the basis of this text is what happens as we read this text if we're keeping in mind the three aspects of human nature in the image of God. So you read this text in one way as it uh, as it relates to corrupt human nature. Then you read this text differently as it relates to a soul regenerated in the image of Christ. And then we see something else going on, or different aspects of this text when we think about the Holy Spirit, who is with the Word. The Word's inspired and active in our lives to put to death the deeds and the thoughts and the kind of the bravado of this corrupt human nature, and at the same time strengthen and empower and energize the soul, which is absolutely humble and selfless, and all those right things that us connected both with the vicarious atoning work of Christ, but also is a nature that follows in his footsteps. So there's a lot, right, to unpack both in a sermon and in Bible class in little different ways, but there's a lot there to work with. So thank you, Eric. Let's take our first break and come back about 7:10, and we'll turn it over to um, Luis, and see you in a minute. Okay, sorry, a minute late. Luis, if you would, you have moderator status.
Okay, very good. Can you all hear me? Nice, great. So, we're going to be looking. Good evening, everyone. So we're looking at this passage in First Corinthians, and um, if we look back at a few verses back, Paul is talking about how the Spirit of God is the one that reveals the understanding, the message of Christ crucified to the people, and only the ones who have the Spirit are the ones who can actually understand this message. Um, but the ones without the Spirit do not accept this message because they do not have the Spirit of God. And then we look at the first couple of verses, and the first thing that pops up as we read this passage is a big contrast. Paul makes a contrast between the spiritual people and people of the flesh. And I'm on verse 1, and if we look up the word pneumatikos, which is spiritual, it's translated as spiritual in this occasion, um, having characteristics of pneuma, of the spirit. We can find it 26 times in the New Testament, and Paul is using 15 times in this very specific letter. First Corinthians is Paul is using this word 15 times in First Corinthians. So Paul is definitely emphasizing the importance of having characteristics, and more specifically, understanding and having the wisdom of the Spirit of God. And if we move to verse 2, we can see a comparison also. Paul is making a comparison of people of the flesh who need milk, or the ones that are not too, yeah, I shouldn't say people of the flesh, but the ones who are not mature enough, they need milk. But the ones who are stronger, who are spiritual, they can eat meat. And again, um, we're talking about understanding the Word of God, the message of Christ crucified. And Paul is using this food analogy to let them know that they're not mature enough. He's letting the Corinthians know, you're not mature enough. You still need milk. You cannot have solid food. And because the way you behave is definitely not the one of a Christian, is not the one of a person who really understands the Spirit. And so when I was reading this, I kind of remembered Hebrews, and the end of Hebrews 5, beginning of Hebrews 6, it talks about this same topic. It says, "For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word." So, but solid food is for the mature, for those who really understand, who has the discernment uh, of good and evil. So the Bible talks about this quite a lot, letting us know that sometimes we are not mature enough if we cannot understand the message. And so Paul is in this part of the letter, he's letting us know that we're immature sometimes, or people is immature sometimes. Um, and in this letter, he gives them some examples. Verse 3, among you there's jealousy and quarreling. Uh, you're walking according to man. Um, and and I kind of like this translation, because walking according to man, um, doing what the world is doing, and again, if we put it, it shouldn't be that way, because if as Christians, we have the Spirit. We be walking according to men, but according to the Spirit. And um, and then we move on to verse 4, and again, and he says, and here's how I can show you that you're still immature and not understanding the message of Christ. You're acting as people, as of the flesh, as non-believers. Some of you say, I am of Paul, or I belong to Paul. And some say, I am of Apollos, I belong to Apollos. And verse 5, but who's Apollos? Who's Paul? They're just man. And if we remember, he also mentioned a little while ago, a little back, they didn't die for your sins. It was Christ. It was Jesus, the one who actually died for them, and they were not getting that message. They were still acting as people of the flesh, as people who didn't really understand, as people who didn't understand the Spirit of God. And in this section, I think it's a good place to remind people that they're not following a pastor, they're not following us as vicars, they're not following a priest or a preacher, they're following Jesus. So I think this is so important in this section, because sometimes there's still like fights or people taking sides and not clearly understanding that it is Christ the one, it is Christ the one who did the work. And in Philippians 1, we're reminded of this. Paul says, and I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So it is God the one who's at work. He started this work, and he's the one who completes this work. It is not a person. It is not a pastor. It is not a preacher. So then, moving on. And in the following verses, Paul reminds again the people that it is God's work, and I really like this translation. Synergos, fellow workers, co-workers. We're co-workers. We're working together. Paul and again, Paul addresses this topic in through this letter, and an example is chapter 12, where he reminds the people that everyone has a different talent, everyone has a different gift, a different ministry, but we all are serving the same God. Synergos, fellow workers, we are co-workers. And synergos is about 13 times in the New Testament, and Paul uses 12 of them. And Paul writes about this again in chapter 12. If we remember 1 Corinthians 12:21, we're all one body. We're all one body. And the eye cannot say to the head, I have no need of you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I have no need of you. And that applies, I think, very it applies to us, to the church, to the people of God. We are all co-workers working together, and it is the work of God. So moving on to the homily outline, I think a good topic or a good title for it will be serving together. And if I was preaching this, I would probably use an analogy or an example of how we sometimes take ownership of things, and in this case, a team, or like in any sport, a basketball, football, whatever. We sometimes take ownership over it, and sometimes we don't truly understand we don't really know what's going on, but we still say it's my team and we won, we lose, whatever. And we take ownership when we are not actually doing much. We're just spectators. And how this can cause division sometimes when it comes to the work of reaching out others, reaching out people for the Lord. This can cause division, and this is showing that if we do this, this is showing that we truly don't understand the Word of God, that we're not understanding the Spirit, and um, and it would be better if we were growing and understanding better. So, um, so Paul here is letting them know again that they're behaving as non-Christians or as people of the flesh. They're fighting, they're jealous, and they're taking teams basically. They're not mature enough to be able to understand the Lord, to be able to understand the message of Christ. And sometimes people may want to take credit for the work they're not even doing, but God is doing that work. And we cannot be acting as if we were of the flesh, as if we were people from the flesh, living as the world, following the world, but we should be living as Christians, and that will probably be part of the big section of the law, and then the 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 gospel is that we are co-workers. Um, we have been called by Jesus to reach others, to bring this good news to other people, and that is uh, it should be our pleasure. It should be something that we really appreciate, this opportunity to be able to participate in His work with Him and reach others for Him, and remembering that it is not our work but His work. Um, and through Jesus, we are united as one body, His body, the church. Yep, yep. Yeah, the success of the body, of course, yeah, will depend on Jesus being the head. Yep, because He's the one who's doing the actual work. And finally, Bible class outline. I think I would like to try to explain a little bit of the contrast of spiritual people and people of the flesh, what it means to be spiritual, and then some of the characteristics of the spiritual people. And here I just have a few verses in Corinthians, Galatians, Second Peter, but there's a lot more. And also some of the characteristics of people of the flesh. And again, some examples: First Corinthians, the first reading of Deuteronomy, and uh, the Gospel, Matthew, where he um, uh, talks about adultery and murder, divorce, and making oaths, and that can harm our relationship. And I think, yep, that'll be basically it. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments. Yes, Joel.
Hey, Luis, great job. Thanks for doing all the hard work. Um, my question is regarding the language, this spiritual milk, right?
Uh-huh.
And what do you think that count? What is that? And what falls into that category? And I guess depending on how you'd answer that question, my follow-on question would also be, do we all do we all as Christians still need um, that spiritual milk? Is that something that we always need?
Got it. Yeah. Um, Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the spiritual milk is probably like the basics, like understanding who Christ is, and or not even that, probably understanding God and love and His mercy and yeah, probably like the most basics. And I'll say probably yes, we all need that spiritual milk, but we cannot be probably living always on that milk, right? So we need solid food because we're as we keep growing, we need to understand different things such as
Right.
murder and adultery and divorce and I don't know,
Right.
living our lives, you know. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm
Because
thinking.
like I don't hear him. I don't know what you think. I don't hear him saying that what they were when they were receiving
Uh-huh.
that's bad, right? It's just that
Mhm.
there's more, right? And but I guess kind of what I'm getting at is I think that there's times, just I don't
Mhm.
know about anybody else, that
Yep.
I need to be reminded of those basics, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
and you know, to completely confess, you know, I probably need to be reminded of those basics more often than I care to admit, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, yeah, I think it's not much of saying that it's bad, but it's more like complaining, like, "Hey guys, you need to grow, right? You need to continue learning about Christ. You need to continue knowing a lot more than just the basics." But like you say, I think we all need the basic stuff. We still need that milk sometimes to be reminded of the very basics. Yes, Chris.
Uh, just listening to the points, and I guess we can make it maybe a bit of a discussion. I'd like to say I kind of actually disagree with that statement. Um, when you have children, once you don't go back to breast milk as a 34, 35-year-old man. Once we leave the milk behind, leave what to say. I mean, once we leave our childhood behind and we become adults, we're talking about food. And when we're using this example here, he says right over here, you're still not ready. You're still of the flesh. I fed you with milk, not with solid food. I mean, he's talking about him like being a baby. For you are not ready for solid food. I have a 9-month-old son. We're feeding him solids. There was a point though in his life where he couldn't have that, and we fed him with milk because he wasn't ready. And I feel like Paul's taking that metaphor here and saying you are still of the flesh, meaning you're still just, you know, a baby. You're still only focused on yourselves. Babies are selfish, even though we love them and they're really cute. Um, yeah, they smile, they make us laugh, and that's good. But when they cry, it's because they want something. They're used to just being taken care of. And I feel like the metaphor here is milk a bad thing? Not really, but I don't think you go back to it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, Gary. Yep.
Um, yeah, time out. Paul, I suppose he was more spiritual when he kind of making that judgment, and he is the spiritual father of that church, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, I guess in a sense, we're as Lutherans, we're always humble, and we're sinners and saints at the same time. But maybe we're excuse me, losing that um, you know tradition. I would say church tradition. The church fathers, they do see themselves, I suppose, as spiritual models that people, Christians can follow. I suppose. I mean, nowadays, who can say that oh, imitate me as I follow Christ and carry the mark of the cross? And who would be bold enough to say that? That's something stupid, right? But Paul said that, and I suppose there's that kind of appreciation of spiritual. I want to use leaders, you know, stronger figures that we can imitate.
Yeah. Yep. Good stuff. Anybody else wants to say anything regarding this topic?
Okay, thank you, Luis, very much, and other students for your questions and the dialogue. Um, let's see what else we can do here. So shifting over a little bit to the notes here. One of the things, this is where in the background of hermeneutics is the eisegesis. So the time and place of writing, the author, the intended audience, the circumstances, and so forth. Sometimes that's that's an easy study, like with Romans, where there's no particular trouble in Rome, except the Jews and Gentiles were, always chafing a little bit with each other, getting along, which Paul addresses. But for the most part, Paul's just sort of like teaching a Bible class from A to Z on Christian theology. But you get to Corinthians, this would be the other end of the spectrum, maybe, where everything is wrong in Corinth. It's just a watershed of the trouble that corrupt human nature makes inside the church. Because when our souls are gathering together as the body of Christ, we're still bringing our human nature with us, and it's still asserting itself. And the history of the Christian church and Christianity is full of that. That's what you learn in Christian history, is how bad human nature is. And so everything's a problem here, and we got to remember that. So like when Luis was mentioning, okay, this business of being the spiritual issues, 15 out of 26 times just in this book, not just in Paul, in his 13 letters, but just in the First Corinthians. But remember that this wouldn't be Paul's choice of topic, is that he's responding to problems that they're having with claims to being spiritual people. And so this is exactly what human nature wants to do with something. If human nature can't live in conquest over something, then it will co-op that something. So in other words, if you can't just ignore God or ignore the church or Christianity or these sorts of things, if they keep impressing themselves on you or around you, they keep coming to you in the course of your life, then if you can't escape them, then you just figure out how to manipulate them. Just turn them into an extension of who you are, and so you get to stay God, and you'll decide how things work, and everybody else just has to deal with it. So I thought it was helpful for Luis to put this contrast up here, spiritual people and people of the flesh. And so I wanted to suggest that we move these two items over here, because the natural man receives not the things of the spirit. We've heard that, I think, even tonight. And so it's the regenerate soul of the Corinthians that is kind of stuck in this infancy, because of the over assertion of their human nature. So it's like, isn't it? It's like certain people still act very childishly, even into their teens and into their early adult years. And some people, all through their life, they just are so childish. And if you go back, oftentimes it's because their parents never let them grow up. In other words, they just kept treating them like infants and children, and they never had an opportunity to develop. So, of course, people of the flesh, this is very indicative, among other things, but this is the human ego right here that's making so much trouble. Okay, now to move on to some more hermeneutical kinds of notes, notice how the pericope you're assigned begins. Unless it's Genesis 1:1, you got to do some backing up here. And so is the same as kind of saying therefore. And so Luis mentioned this earlier, so we got to go back. It's probably better to start with 1 Corinthians 1, verse 1, and get a running start and see what he's been working on here. And then I made this note in particular, and I hope that, like I said, even if you can't make notes on the whole because your 9 hours a week run out, um, try going a little deeper sometimes, or some of these other activities like copying a larger section of the text both before and after, take the chapter and verse numbers out, and then kind of format the text on a page to see how it flows. And maybe make some notes like, is he moving from topic to topic, or is there a development on the same topic? Kind of a stepping back and get the big picture, and then work your way back in again to see how the parts contribute to the whole. Kind of like, an engine, automobile engine. First, study that thing as well as you can from every angle. What does it have to do with the rest of the car, and how do the parts that you can see interact with each other, and then disassemble it and see what's on the inside of it there, and so forth. At the level of language and words, just a note here, and you have to be careful because English translations will not be consistent. But the Greek word laleo, not exclusively public speaking, but most of the time public speaking, and speaking in public having to do both the way people assume that there's authority in things that are said in public, and also in the effects of things being said in public. So that's um, a person wants to be especially careful about doing what's called laleo in Greek. Talking, on the other hand, is not exclusively privately, but is more like, one or, well, two or more people just having a conversation with each other where there are no assumptions, or at least fewer assumptions about the authority of what a person has to say, the reliability of it, and so forth. And so this is so important in historical, in the last 50 years or so, this conflict in the church about what does it mean when Paul says, I don't permit women to speak in the church. Notice how an awareness of the language solves the problem right away. So in fact, it's not just that Paul doesn't allow women to speak in church. He doesn't really allow anybody to speak in church. And there's another word, church, not a building, but when the body of Christ comes together, so it becomes visible and therefore public, if you will, even if it's behind closed doors, it's still visible. Then the person who is representing Christ, the pastor in that setting, has both divine commands and responsibilities, but authority also to speak the oracles of God, to speak what it is God would speak. And God holds us to super high accountability there, which is why that's the person to do the speaking. Just like if Jesus showed up in our classroom, I'd turn my microphone off because that's who we want to listen to. As opposed to this word, um, which of everybody, lots inside of a building, a space, or during the course of most of the Christian's life, we have conversations with each other. But this is where humility makes us polite and interested and cordial. How do I know if what I think is true or not if I don't compare it to what everybody else has to say, and if I don't submit what I think, which we're that's the question we're going to get to at the end of class. If I don't submit what I'm thinking to the examination by other people who are faithful. So also, when thinking about the questions that Luis brought up, sometimes the Bible is speaking very pointedly and directly at our human nature. Sometimes it's speaking directly about our regenerate soul. So, every intent of the thought of man is only evil all the time. That's our human nature. Whoever is generated from God doesn't sin. Indeed, he cannot, because he's been generated of God. That's the regenerate soul. Other times, some texts are speaking to the whole of us. And it's really important, whether in Bible class or sermons or just, in conversations, to make sure we're reminding the people who are listening to us, this text is talking to the whole person. And so this is how the text addresses our human nature. This is how the text addresses our soul. Yeah, thank you. So here is another way of approaching text and thinking about the content is what material in this letter from Paul is disabling the outer man, and that has to do with law, with exposing and then condemning, rebuking the human ego, and then empowering or maturing the inner person when he talks about how God chose, the end of chapter 1, how God chose the things that are weak and poor and unknown, even the things that are not, God chose to put to shame the things that are. Jesus Christ and him crucified. There's all of the language that describes what God does for us. That speaks to the soul. Oh yeah. Also, and you need the Greek to do this because the English translation is missing it here. But this, there's two words in Greek that gets translated but one of them, Allah, is really focused on the contrast between two things as opposed to de, which is just it's a conjunction, so it could mean and some of the time. So right here is where it's the same word as here. These are the same words, and so Paul's drawing the same parallel or contrast in these two places. And so if you could work out a formatting if you were, putting this text out on a page, you could format it so that we could actually have a look at that. And I think in our next presentation, I actually did a little formatting for us to look at maybe next week. I don't know, but we'll see some of that. Let's go on. These outlines, and there's a page 3. Oh, that's his. Yeah. So we're about actually right on time. Before we take our second break, anybody have a question that they want to ask about this text? Okay, let's take a break. I'll see you back in about 5 minutes or so. 7:50. Yeah, 7:50, and I'll turn it over to Krista. Okay, we're back, and Krista, if you'd like to take over, please.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. It looks to me like these are not all of my notes, so I did post a link over in the chat spot to the Google Doc, if that's helpful for anyone. There should be the student response column on there too, and mine's like 4 pages, so. Okay, but to jump in, this is Matthew 5, 21 to 37, which comes from the Sermon on the Mount. Just before we kind of dive into those verses, I thought it would be helpful to look at context. Back in chapter 4, Jesus begins his ministry, and I think that's right after the baptism and temptation, and then he begins his public ministry, and it says in verse 417, from that time Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So it's kind of a summary verse of his message. From there, he goes on to call the first disciples. He ministers to great crowds. He travels. He begins to teach in synagogues, and he heals people. And then we have the Sermon on the Mount, which begins with him going up on a mountain and beginning to teach. And in this text specifically, he's referencing the 10 Commandments, or at least a handful of the 10 Commandments very specifically. And I thought it was an interesting connection that he goes up on a mountain and speaks about the law of Moses, which also came down from a mountain. So in Dr. Eschelbeck's notes over here, he says, what is going on here, especially in view of the previous 4 chapters in chapter 8 and 9 and 12? And so I noticed when I looked at those chapters that a theme here, I believe, is Jesus asserting and demonstrating his authority over the law, both the law of God, which in this passage he is interpreting the law of God with authority, and he does the same thing in chapter 12 in his words on the Sabbath. But he also asserts authority over the laws of nature and the spiritual realm in chapters 8 and 9, where we see healings, he calms a storm, he casts out demons, and he even forgives sins. Okay, cool. All right. So, yeah, so just that one of the themes here is Jesus speaking with authority, and he's acknowledged at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It says that the people were in awe because he spoke as one with authority. So to kind of jump into these verses, the first chunk here is, one more note on context. The section right before verse 21, which is called, in my Bible, it's called Christ came to fulfill the law. In that section, Jesus points out that he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Okay, so there's the full notes, if that's helpful. So Jesus says he's not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And the last verse, right before verse 21, reads, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So this is kind of a setting the bar passage in terms of what it means to fulfill the law. So first, there's the section on you shall not murder, and each of these sections has this refrain or pattern in it where he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. So in this one, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry, you'll be liable to judgment. And then he goes on to say there's kind of a threefold pattern here. So there's, if you are angry, you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult, a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. When I kind of looked at those words and what they meant and the insults, or like what was being described here, I felt like it looked to me like if you are angry, if you insult, if you say you fool, that those are all equivalent offenses. It didn't look, when I looked at, I don't know Greek, but when I kind of looked at the Greek definitions, it didn't look like you fool was an especially offensive comment. It looked like it means basically what it means in English. And so those all seemed kind of like equal offenses. But in each time it's iterated, the consequence gets greater. So liable to judgment, liable to the council, which is the word for Sanhedrin, and liable to the hell of fire. And that word is Gehenna, which is the word used for hell of eternal punishment, which is opposed to, there are different words used for hell. And one of the other options would be Hades, which is where the ungodly await the return of Christ. But this use of the word is the punishment hell, the eternal punishment. So not good. So it seems like the transgression in the list do not escalate, but the punishment consequences escalate with each occurrence. And so I felt like this was an emphasis of how serious sin is. You know, even just, you know, calling your brother a fool is enough to get you sent to eternal hell of punishment. So then he goes on to say, the next section of this chunk is about reconciliation. So he says, when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there and go and be reconciled. And I thought one of the questions here was, what is the relationship of this verse with Matthew 18? And I think it definitely correlates with Matthew 18 and with the instructions to Christians to be reconciled to each other. And I kind of said over there that we're supposed to be one body. And I think this ties in perfectly with the epistle passage, the 1 Corinthians passage that we were just looking at. You know, as Christ's body, we cannot be in right relationship with God and not be in a right relationship with each other. That isn't possible. Okay, so yeah, kind of, I know I'm not going to have time to go over all of this, but yeah, going down to verse 26, where he says, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. All of the language in this passage is pretty extreme, right? So starting even in verse 18, which is before this passage starts with, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus is really emphasizing here the final and complete and extreme nature of the law. There's no loopholes or wiggle room. This is very definite. So then the next section is on lust and adultery. So you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So I'm going to skip to the question that was asked, that Dr. Eshelbeck asked here about, is Jesus being figurative here about your eye and your hand, right? So if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. That's sort of an alarming verse, right? But like I have pointed out, all of the language in this passage is very extreme, and that doesn't mean that it isn't literal in a sense. Like it's certainly true, all like it's not being overblown or extreme. It's serious, right? But I think that this is specifically hyperbolic language to demonstrate how serious sin is. After all, if you cut off your hand, it won't actually fix your sinful nature. It isn't literally your hand that is causing you to sin, it's your sinful heart. And so I think what is more being said here goes back to that verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. I think what is happening here is that Jesus is saying, if your intention is to keep the law on your own merit, and you plan to be saved in that way, then you need to get serious about it, to the point of like gouging out your eye or cutting off your hand. Like, this is, I think he's pointing to the futility of the whole project, right? That we can't do that. So I'm not going to do this page in much depth because of time. But there's the next section is on divorce, and it ties in with Matthew 19, where Jesus also addresses divorce, and his language on divorce is also very extreme, right? Divorce is adultery, basically, is what Jesus says about that. And then we can ask the practical question about, okay, well, what about Christians getting divorces? Is it okay? Is it ever okay? Is it never okay? But I think for the point of this passage, the point here is, regardless of the circumstances that lead to divorce, divorce always happens because of sin, right? And we're all sinful, and we're all culpable under the law. And so, yeah, like the plan is to be righteous. There isn't a way that you're going to be able to justify divorce. Is kind of what it comes down to. I'm going to skip ahead for time. So I am not, if you hadn't guessed, I'm not in the habit of writing or preaching sermons. But when I was thinking about the homily outline, and looking at this text, I was thinking that this is a very law-heavy text, and there isn't really a specific verse of gospel in here. But as I was reading this text, it continuously reminded me of the story of the rich young ruler, which is also in Matthew. And it reminded me of this story because Jesus also lists the 10 Commandments in that passage in response to the question that the young man asks, which is, what must I do to be saved? And so I thought I would use that as the theme for this sermon, the question, what must I do to be saved? And that is the wrong question. The answer to the question, what must I do to be saved, is always going to be, you must keep the law. And Jesus references those 10 Commandments, and the rich young ruler says, yep, I've done that. And then Jesus tells him to sell his possessions, and he goes away sad. And the disciples, they despair, and they say, who then can be saved? And then comes the verse of gospel, which is, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And then it says in here immediately, but it's not quite immediately, it's a few verses later. Following the story of the rich young ruler is the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, who are each paid the same regardless of the length of the effort that they put in. And so I would kind of go to the direction of, the good news is that what must I do to be saved is the wrong question. The answer is always keep the law, which is impossible. And then there's some really cool parallels between, in Matthew specifically, if you look at the early chapters of Matthew, between the journey of the Israelites and Jesus's ministry. If you look, as recounted specifically in Matthew, if you looked at the call out of Egypt, and then through the Red Sea, and the way that parallels with Jesus' baptism, then the wandering in the wilderness of the Israelites with the temptation in the wilderness of Jesus, and then Moses called up on the mountain, and Jesus interpreting the law in the Sermon Mount. So this kind of is these parallel events demonstrate that Jesus is doing what Israel could not. He keeps the law perfectly. He kind of for us, for what we could not do. So then the right question is, how am I saved? it's because of Jesus, right? By the blood of Christ. And so then for the Bible study outline, I thought it would be neat to compare this passage with Exodus 20 and the original giving of the Ten Commandments. Looking at questions like what is the significance of the mountain as a link between these two passages, walking through some of the similarities and differences, and then good application points would be what is the function of the law in the life of a believer, and what is Jesus trying to communicate in this text about the kingdom of heaven and about the law and about salvation. So that is pretty much what I have. Does anyone have any questions, I guess? Yes, go ahead, Chris.
Hi, Kristen. Well done. First off, I guess it's kind of a general question. Do you see any irony in the the fact that Jesus preaches on divorce, and then the very next section it's about oaths and taking them, not taking them? Do you feel like they kind of apply backwards and forwards?
To be honest, I hadn't thought about that at all, but now that you say that, that does seem interesting. Yeah. Yeah, carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. Yeah, I could see a connection there, I guess. I hadn't thought of that before, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Krista. And anyone, you can always jump back in if you think of a question for Krista, just address it to her, and I'll turn my microphone off and she can turn hers on. So thank you for that work. Sorry I didn't have it all there to begin with, which is kind of a commercial reminder. It's very helpful to me if before you're presenting. So, well, yeah, when you have your document the way you want it, it's really helpful if you can email that to me as a Word document rather than me going to the Google Docs and cutting and pasting. I just noticed Google Docs is really hard to manipulate things in, and I'm trying to, sometimes you'll notice I move the text around in the column widths to try to get things lined up and get them on the same page for when we're in class together. So I'm glad, Krista, that you mentioned that there's some missing, and I just went and got it. But anyway, okay. So a couple of things. I mentioned, oh, I know what, here's the problem. Okay. Pregnancy here. So did you notice that each commandment is pregnant, meaning when you read the commandment, thou shalt not murder, it's actually, there's so much more to it than that, right? So commandment by commandment, there's an expression of the ideal in plain language, but then there's a lot there, okay, right? Let me see, I'm just catching up on my notes. Yeah, okay, I wanted to touch a moment on this little section right here. And so here's a moment where even if you are using an English, the Young's Concordance, when you can see if you're tracking the same original word or not, fool will come up. And this relates to Matthew 7, verse 1, which we haven't gotten to yet in the text, but Jesus will say, judge not that you may not be judged. Did we look at that word in the first couple weeks of class? We might have, but this is one of those, judge not is a semantic domain. So the word judge or judge not, Matthew 7, verse 1, means everything from diagnosis, which is what physicians do, to observations or calls about rule breaking, which is what referees do, to sentencing to execution, which is what a judge would do when someone's convicted of murder. But all of those are judgments. The reason we don't call physicians' work judging is because it's positive and helpful, the diagnosis. It's intended to restore life. The reason we call the referee's work a call and not a judgment is because it's in the interest of providing for um, the game to work the way it's intended to work. But the judgment is really condemnation in this sense. And so all over the place, the Bible tells us we have responsibilities to speak the truth to each other in love, which includes rebuking one another or confronting each other. Matthew 18 is how you do that. But to condemn someone is to say something like, you're going to hell when you die, or it's impossible for you to be saved, or this is over, or everything's finished. See, any of that kind of concluding language, which we are usurping God's place in doing so, that's one reason Jesus um, forbids it, but it's also because we couldn't possibly know. And so it intersects with this text where Jesus says, don't swear by heaven or earth because you don't know what you can or can't do or what will or won't happen. So just be honest about your situation you know, in the context of life. And so here, don't call anyone fool because fool in biblical literature actually means unbeliever, and so a person who's condemned under the law. So both Psalm 14 and 53 have this verse, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So so fool in Hebrew and Greek is not like it is in English, where you could substitute, stupid or dumb or those kinds of like, lack of intellectual ability. This is not interested in this at all. In fact, Hebrew and Greek have words for stupid, but this is unbeliever, which is a condemnatory judgment that we wouldn't want to make on a person, and we certainly wouldn't want it to be true, which is why Jesus says, now your own life is at stake in doing so. Verse 23, and oh, yeah, Jose.
So, so yesterday I was teaching some students during Sunday school, and we were talking about the Trinity, and we were talking about the so-called Jesus only or the Oneness Pentecostals. They deny the Trinity, and I noticed that in certain occasions, say some of the church fathers would say that these people are not, if they deny those, they are damned. For instance, the Athanasius Creed would say that at the end, that if you do not believe or what we are confessing, then you are damned. Would that be kind of like one way of saying without calling somebody a fool?
That's a really good question, and I'm so grateful that you brought that up. And so there is a difference between describing circumstances or conditions, right? So the Athanasian Creed or other statements like in the Book of Concord, unless a person believe these things, or saying it contrary, if a person contradicts these things, they cannot be saved. That's a description of a reality. It's not being applied to one person or another in particular. Yeah, so thanks for asking that. Okay, this business of, oh yeah, Joel.
Sorry about that. Um, on this, the point you made regarding fool, So you're saying that that word is more within the context of unbeliever, right? In this case.
Absolutely about unbeliever. That's precisely and only what it's about, really.
Okay. And so would it be I don't know Hebrew. So is that so this is more along the line of something like Psalm 14, like the fool says in his heart, there is no God, or the fool for the fool speaks folly and his heart is busy with iniquity in Isaiah, right? That's along this same line, right?
Right. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. And so, just we can think about how, just before we go on, but it kind of intersects with the next subject about if your brother has something against you, or you think you have something against a brother. Um, Jesus said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." Um, and so in Christianity, the way is the destination. Jesus isn't a stepping stone to get someplace else where we actually want to be, but the path. So every moment of every day has significance, and we don't want to skip any of it or skip over any of it, but we want to embrace every moment and the content of that moment for what God intends to accomplish in it. And so, um, why am I talking about that? I lost my train of thought. Judgments. So coming to judgments about things. We, so the way is the destination, not getting to the end of it. Same thing in our relationships with people. Um, we don't need to, and it's not helpful to come to conclusions about things like, you're always this way, or you're never that way, or you'll never be, especially when we make predictions, or you'll always be this way, because we don't know. And it's so much less stressful, let alone, keeping ourselves out of God's judgment against us, to remain students, to be inquiring, to ask questions, to try and understand people and have conversations with them, rather than to just make conclusions about them or judgments about them. Even in classes, the students often get frustrated with me because they just want the answers. But I can't give them the answers for two reasons. One is because then they don't know how the answer was arrived at, and the way is the part that's really important. And the second is that all too often students will take answers and use them as hammers, instead of as maybe uh, I don't know, something to as a floor, right? A basis for conversation with people rather than a judgment against them. Okay, now I really want to get to this place because a lot of people know Matthew 18. If your brother sins, it doesn't have to be against you, by the way. The text is pretty clear about that. Go and tell him his fault between you and him, and so forth. And never mind that rarely gets practiced, that process. But here's the other side of it, and I have rarely met a person who's aware of or keeps in mind Matthew 5. And what an interesting, what would this look like in our families, our homes, our parishes, if we, imagine walking up, you're in line for communion, and then you turn out of the line and you walk back to someone else in line, or you walk back and right out of the church to find someone that has something against you, and appeal to them to be reconciled with you. Wow, what a powerful witness that would be, right? So quite the opposite of making judgments about someone. You'd be appealing to them for reconciliation. Okay, now I see one of my notes is missing here. Um, but it's on verse 26. So I'll get here. Here, you'll never get out till you've paid the last penny. I want to make sure you know that intersected with uh, the second half of Matthew 18 about the unforgiving servant. I think Krista mentioned that too, and rightly so. We want to hold Matthew 5 and Matthew 18 together because they speak so much to each other. And so you notice just good sense and reason that God sets before us. Better to come to terms with people before it has to go to court. Paul addresses that in 1 Corinthians 6 also. So from both sides of the occasion, better to humble yourself and come to a conclusion about a matter of law before you get to the courts. And on the other side of the equation, why not rather suffer wrong, being wronged by someone, a brother especially, rather than to be in a hurry to go to the courts? Now, of course, maybe some of you have noticed this before. How are you going to get out of jail um, because you owe a big debt if you're in jail and so not able to work? And I know there's a whole history behind debtorisms and how they worked, and it's really more like a hostage. You take a person hostage, and the people that care about that person are responsible to kind of come up with um, the payment of the debt. But I wanted to, because that use of the words "the last penny," just reference the Matthew 18 parable a little bit, because right on the face of it, of course, it's a contrast between the first servant who owes a big debt to the master and the second servant who owes a small debt to the first servant. And of course, the master brings that out. I forgave you the big debt. How could you not be forgiving of the person who owed you a little debt? Notice how that plays into what would keep us from murdering someone or even hating them? What would keep us from coveting or from adultery or from speaking ill of another person? It would be this perspective of, wow, if God has forgiven me all of my debt and it was enormous, why would I ever want to turn to judge in the other direction? This is something that Paul was acutely aware of ever since his conversion account, right? So where Peter kind of is back and forth like a pendulum on works righteousness versus salvation by grace, and this is why Paul took him to task about it, just was furious with him at Antioch. That's in Galatians 2. Um, it was because Paul had this huge sense of the debt that had been forgiven him. But Paul's more guilty under the law than any of the rest of us. And by the way, it's always fun to check a little bit. Um, the first servant owed the master 10,000 talents. If that was gold, it would be $14 billion today. If it was silver, it'd be $165 million. And so two things come to mind. Of course, the first is, how would you ever pay that off? If you owed $1,000 or even $100,000, how would you pay that off especially from prison? But more importantly, the question should come to mind, I hope it did for you, how did this person accrue such a debt? How is it possible for a man in a relatively short lifetime here, presumably he's not an old man, how did he rack up a $14 billion debt? And of course, what's the parable is trying to put into perspective is when every intent of the thought of your heart is only evil all the time, you're racking up debts 24/7 before God, and because it's before God and towards God or against God, that's got some really, really serious debt consequences there. Okay, Krista mentioned the yod and the where is it? Jesus is emphasizing the extreme nature of the law. Not one yod or tittle will be um, relaxed from the law. I'm trying to find on page 2. Oh, okay. Hang on, I'm trying to. Well, let me just go here. That mention of Yod and Tittle. So if you haven't had Hebrew, let me give you just a little lesson here quickly. Hebrew letters all kind of fit in a box like this, nice and neat. That's Aleph, and this is Beit, and this is Gimel, G, A, B, G. Okay. The smallest of the Greek letters, well, it shouldn't have a hump in it like that. It should just be like that. Is the Yod. That's the smallest letter. And so that's why not the smallest of the letter of the law, but also really important is, so here's the letter B, here's the letter R, and here's the letter D. Okay, so B and R and D all kind of have a similar, this sort of a thing going on. Okay, this little part that sticks off the back of the stem, that's called a tittle. And so some English translations will call it the least stroke of the law. So there is a moment now and then when a Bible dictionary actually may do you some good, or maybe a reliable kind of a um, technical commentary would provide that kind of information, like what the heck is Yod and Tittle referring to? Okay, so now I was eager to get back to this. Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. My computer just stopped because it didn't have enough battery, and I didn't think it would do that, but it did. So I know some things about Greek and Hebrew. I don't know enough about computers. So back to if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Krista had some good instincts about that, although she was wondering if this wasn't hyperbolic or hyperbole. Here it is. Here's the text. Whoops. Um, yeah. Okay. So what Krista mentioned is true. It's not actually our eye that causes us to sin, nor is it our hand that causes us to sin. But what Jesus is trying to get through our heads is the magnitude of the problem. Is that if that would seem impossible, that there's no way I'm going to take my eye out or cut my hand off because I would rather go into hell with all my body parts than to be in heaven without a hand. He's really pressing us to weigh that. The second thing is, and Chris is also right about this, it's the heart that causes us to sin, not the extensions of our body, our limbs, or our eyes, our senses. And so it's the heart that needs to be changed. And then let's move forward and think about that. So again, if you were to use a concordance, you would find Ezekiel 36, verses 24 and following, where this is exactly how one aspect of God's redeeming work is described. God will take out our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh and put his spirit in us and cause us to walk in his statutes and so forth. So it's the heart that has to change. Similarly, Paul talks about crucifying our members which are on the earth, our human nature. Well, that's not a figure of speech. Now, so we slow down and we think about what crucifixion is all about. Just like last week, Jesus Christ and him crucified. What's that mean? So crucify your members which are on the earth, which means you do to your corrupt human nature and its desires just what people did to someone who is crucified, which is you hold them up to contempt. So you look at yourself and you say, all of these passions and lusts that I have are making all kinds of misery for me and for everyone around me. So they are accursed. So until I'm willing to see things that way, I'm never actually going to repent of anything. And so two last things. One more about this text, and then I want to look at a question from the quiz that Gary mentioned. I know we're going over a little, but we have latitude to do that. Krista mentioned this is a law-heavy text. You're absolutely right. Nobody can argue with that. This is one of those texts, and I'm filling in on Sunday, so I'll be preaching on this text where you see Jesus as the contrast. Okay, so did Jesus murder anyone? No, but he traded places with a murderer. Did Jesus ever hate anyone? No, in fact, he loved his enemies, which includes me, besides those people that we see in the narratives. Did Jesus ever insult anyone? Or on the contrary, did Jesus assume people's failings, which we would insult them for, in his own person? So, like the woman caught in adultery, or the woman that came behind him and washed his feet with her tears and so forth. Jesus defended her and protected her, and her reproach fell on him. Did Jesus ever commit adultery? No. But in fact, he's faithful to an adulterous wife, and that's where we could think about Hosea as of that in history. Did Jesus divorce us? No. In fact, he was executed as an adulterous person, irresponsible and loveless, precisely in order to reconcile us in our union with God our Father. Did Jesus ever swear about anything? No, he used the most humble, modest terms about himself, and so allowed his the plain truth of what he had to say, the simplicity. We started that with our first text tonight, a text that's very simple, plain, and clear, as Eric noted. You can do that. You can always, whichever direction, if your text is heavy in law or gospel, you can always use that as a contrast. And doing that in homilies and Bible classes, or even in conversations with people, you will begin to make better exegetes, better interpreters or understanders of the Bible by doing that. So let me encourage you along those lines. Okay, so last thing to do tonight is have a look at a quiz question, and I want to commend Gary for, it's not the first week this has happened either, because I missed, I said something was true and it was false because I forgot to mark it and all that sort of thing, but anyway, there we go. To push back, I know the students, it takes them a little while to get used to that, to being congratulated and encouraged to raise questions against the professor, but that's where we make lots of progress. Okay, so here's question 6, which is supposed to be true because I didn't have it in red ink or struck out. Paul related in his very first epistle, so far so good, that he submitted his own teachings to the apostles in Jerusalem to be sure he wasn't communicating the word of God faithfully. So here's the verse, and Paul went up according to revelation. So some God revealed to Paul that he should check in or stop in to see them. And here he anatithemi, and he laid before them, autus, this A should be down here, the gospel which he preached among the Gentiles, but alone by themselves with those who seemed to be, the pillars of the church, the apostles, especially Peter, James, and John, lest somehow in vain I was running or had run. And so I was, maybe this wasn't as, maybe this didn't sound enough like exactly what Paul was saying in Galatians 2, verse 2, but that's what was intended. Gary, do you want to speak to that, or is this okay now? Gary, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Um, so it is true or false? Can you hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I'm asking if it is true or false. So,
Okay. So it is true, and I intended it to be true, but I mean, I understood Gary sounded like he was concerned that I was suggesting, or that this is a possibility that Paul could have been wrong about what he was teaching or preaching, and of course we know not. Paul received his revelation directly from God. He references that earlier in Galatians. It comes up again late in 2 Corinthians in chapter 13. And so no question about from God's side of the equation that Paul was faithfully as an apostle communicating the gospel. And yet that's not antithetical to that doesn't make it problematic for an apostle, especially Paul, given the circumstances of his past, to humble himself, to very modestly check in with the rest and make sure that he's not, missing something or whatever. Apollos spent a little time coming up to speed. Priscilla and Aquila, people. This wouldn't be true of an apostle, but I'm just using it as an example. And for us especially, and the things I love about having the Christ College is that we listen to each other and we check in with each other and look at each other's work, and we're accountable to each other because these are very high stakes. So I guess that's resolved, and that's good. Thanks everybody that presented tonight. Next Monday, we have Tim Potoff and Michael Schutzler and Chris Simmons. And Tim and Michael and Chris, if you're sure your work is how you want it, I already printed it, so it looks like you have everything there. For some reason, you wanted to make changes, just let me know that with an email and attach the latest, latest version. And I think that's it for tonight, everyone. God bless you and your week. Chris.
I don't mean to hold everyone up. I can wait till everyone leaves. I was just going to ask you about my presentation next week.
Well, I'm here and they're leaving if they want to, so go ahead.
Great. When I pull it up on Blackboard, it doesn't have any of your notes yet. I didn't know if it was like I had to wait my turn, and according to the schedule, I present on the 24th, and next week's the 17th. But I'll do whatever you want. It's obviously already done, so.
Well, the schedule I'm looking at, which is the newest one I posted, has you on the 17th.
Oh, and yeah, that's good with me.
Yeah, and you're ready. And
Mm.
I thought my are you talking about the Google Docs? My notes aren't there.
Yeah, the Google Docs.
Oh, okay. That means I forgot to put them there. I'll do that, Chris. So you'll have them by later tonight.
Great. I didn't know if it was waiting so long
Yeah.
if I was in trouble or like,
No, no, no. It's just the absent-minded professor.
all right.
All right.
No
Thank you.
problem. Great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep. Good
All
night.
right. Bye-bye.